Welcome to episode 3 of ranking every Doctor Who story ever. If you haven't seen the first 2 episodes, there are links in the description if you want to check those out. Also, as usual, remember that this list is only my opinion, and if you like different stories than me, that's totally fine. And I'd like to give a quick shout out to the Instagram account Whovian News, which featured this channel on their story. That was really awesome, so if you're watching, thanks for that, and I'm going to put a link to that account in the description. Now let's get right into it. In 270th place, we go to Season 15 with Underworld. People make fun of classic Doctor Who special effects all the time, but I really don't mind bad effects if the plot is good enough. However, Underworld's problems go far beyond the low-budget CSO. That being said, the first episode is quite good, as it introduces some interesting plot elements, such as a crew who has been doing more or less the same thing for 100,000 years, and the fact that Time Lords can grant regeneration power to other races. However, these concepts matter very little to the remainder of the story, which consists mostly of characters running around and fighting each other. Important parts of this story seem to be missing, particularly with regards to the crew of the spaceship. For the first half of the story, the crew of the spaceship endeavors to learn where their race banks are. However, it's never shown on screen how the crew members learn where the race banks are. The crew just shows up at one point and attacks the people who have access to the race banks. The society in the underworld also receives precious little explanation. For such a seemingly complicated society with slaves, guards, seers, and the Oracle, very little is explained about how the society ended up this way. It's ironic that there's so much underdevelopment of certain aspects of the story, because there are other scenes, such as one shot of K9 heading back through a cave, that are far longer than they need to be. Moving up to 269th, we go to the new show with Sleep No More. At first, this story really intrigued me, as the concept of Morpheus was quite interesting. Sleep does take up about a third of a human's life, so it was totally unfair of the Doctor to dismiss the idea of Morpheus as a purely greedy thing. If it weren't for the Sandmen, it could actually be a great thing for people. Unfortunately, the episode is ultimately not very good. The whole found footage format doesn't really add anything to the story, and it basically feels like a gimmick. The story ultimately falls into a very generic Base Under Siege format. It's really too bad, because the concept of reducing sleep time could have been used so much better. Moving up to 268th, we have another Capaldi story, The Lie of the Land. This story screams of wasted potential. It has a couple of fantastic lines, such as Nardal's line about convincing people that the way things are now are how they've always been, and Missy's line about the Doctor's version of good. Unfortunately, the story as a whole does not even come close to matching the promise of those lines. For starters, the fact that the Doctor manipulated Bill into shooting him was pretty screwed up. Also, the ultimate solution to the monk's oppression is Bill thinking about her mom. Ultimately, despite some interesting ideas, this story is a pretty basic Earth invasion tale with a very cheap conclusion. Now for 267th, it's The Awakening. I'm not sure if classic Doctor Who was actually bad at writing 2-part stories, or if they simply allotted only 2 episodes for stories they felt had very little potential. Either way, The Awakening is one of the weakest in an already weak group of 2-part classic-era stories. It has totally uninteresting villains and a man who just wants power, and a stone alien stuck in a wall. The whole plot being based on a psychic energy was kind of contrived. It sounds like a concept you'd hear about from a crazy lady with a crystal ball, not the Doctor. Meanwhile, the story's cliffhanger is quite bizarre. The Doctor tears open the wall with the monster in it like it's his birthday present. Another thing that I didn't like about this story is that the most promising part of it, the idea that reenacting a historical event could cause something to reactivate, ultimately doesn't even matter, as the Malice, which is the stone villain, wakes up before the full reenactment actually happens. The few nice things I can say about this story are that the costumes look pretty good, some of the supporting characters are fun, and it isn't too long. In 266th, it's going to be the first third Doctor story I've talked about, The Time Monster. If I had to use one word to describe this story, it would be sloppy. While no individual aspects of this story are terrible, it really doesn't hold together well as a full work. Characters that featured heavily in the first 4 episodes just stop appearing until the end, and are ultimately pretty unimportant to the story. The compelling cliffhanger at the end of episode 4 is solved too quickly and with too much ease. Crassus just stands next to the Master and does almost nothing for most of the story. Ultimately, this story feels like a mashup of leftover footage from other stories. For example, The Soldiers Out of Time from the War Games, mysterious non-physical locations from The Mind Robber, The scene set in Atlantis from the Underwater Menace, rapid aging from the Daleks' master plan, etc. It's also one of the worst cases of the Master's plans feeling repetitive, to the point that he seems like a Plankton or Dr. Doofenshmirtz-style cartoon villain who always fails in more or less the same way. At least the story has some saving graces. The standoff between the Doctor and the Master and their TARDISes towards the end of episode 6 is a great scene. Moving into 265th, I'm going with Delta and the Bannermen. This story is full of wasted potential. The concept of a last surviving member of a species escaping death was a really compelling idea, but without any explanation as to why the Bannermen wanted to wipe out the Shimmerans, it wasn't particularly interesting in practice. Similarly, while the relationship between the alien Delta and human Billy could have been interesting, it happened way too quickly to be in any way believable. There are also several writing errors that bug me. For example, the Doctor somehow knows the name of Delta without her ever stating her name. Also, I still don't understand why the Bannermen let the Doctor escape at the beginning of episode 3. The story also contains a bunch of random, unnecessary characters. That being said, it has a fun 50s vibe, and it's only 3 episodes, so it's still very watchable. Moving up to 264th, it's a missing story, The Smugglers. There are several stories with missing episodes that are still incredibly entertaining, but a story like The Smugglers, which seems to be reliant on swashbuckling action scenes, is really hard to sit through without the original film. I can't rank this story any higher right now because at present it's a snooze fest. But if this story is ever animated or rediscovered, it may turn out to be a pretty exciting adventure with a nice atmosphere. So, fingers crossed. Up into 263rd, it's Warriors of the Deep. You know a story has a bad reputation when I put it 263rd, and I feel like I have to explain why I didn't put it any lower. The reason is, for the most part, I actually think the last episode is really good. Of course, that only partially makes up for the complete train wreck that is the first 3 episodes. The first phase of the story is basically just the TARDIS crew and the base's crew playing hide and seek. The first cliffhanger is one of the worst in the show's history. The Doctor spends about 2 seconds in the water, and Turlough concludes that he drowned. Of course, it wouldn't be a Warriors of the Deep review without complaining about the Merca. There's not really anything left to be said about this, but yeah, it sucks. And that scene where the lady tries to karate chop it is possibly the lowest point of the entirety of Classic Who. Another issue I had with this story that doesn't get talked about as much is the way it portrayed the dynamic between the Silurians and the Sea Devils. While the 2 races were basically portrayed as equals in their respective Pertwee serials, this story portrays the Silurians as the intellectuals and the Sea Devils as the foot soldiers. As I said though, this story's saving grace is its pretty solid final episode. The Silurians' actual plan is finally revealed and sends a decent message about nuclear proliferation. Also, Davison is stellar, and his final line is quite profound. Even the final episode isn't without issues, though. I find it unfathomable that a missile system would have such a complicated and esoteric failsafe system. While the story does have its strong moments towards the end, it pretty much deserves its poor reputation. Up to 262nd, another story people probably expected to be even lower, is Love and Monsters. This is a really easy story to make fun of, but I actually like a decent amount of it. Elton is a solid protagonist, and Jackie Tyler has perhaps her finest moment when she yells at Elton. I think the real issue with this story is that it didn't seem to know if it wanted to be a lighthearted comedy or a darker, more sinister piece. Had it stuck entirely to its lighthearted tone or fully embraced a darker one, I think it could have been quite good. But I just can't like a story that has one of the highest kill counts of developed characters and also has the line, "She tastes like chicken." It's such a stark dichotomy that I feel weird laughing at the funny parts or feeling sad about the darker parts. Also, personal sidebar, but for whatever reason, the Absorbaloff was the one monster from Doctor Who that really scared me when I was a little kid. The Empty Child never really scared me, the Weeping Angels never really scared me, but something about that Absorbaloff just really creeped me out. Up to 261st, we're going back to the Hartnell era with the War Machines. Other than doing a decent job of introducing Ben and Polly and being the closest thing to a First Doctor unit story, this serial is entirely unremarkable. The plot makes absolutely no sense. Why would a supercomputer that can control people's minds try to take over the world by constructing a dozen clunky machines that can be easily disabled with a magnetic field or a baseball bat? Also, the voice of the computer, Votan, sounds nothing like what one would expect from an omniscient computer to sound like. And it doesn't help that it calls the Doctor, Doctor Who. And of course, Dodo's exit has to be one of the most forgettable companion exits ever. But in fairness, her kind of wandering out of the TARDIS, just like she wandered in, was pretty fitting for her character. Up to 260th, it's going to be the first Troughton story I've talked about, Fury from the Deep. This missing story is considered by many to be a classic, but personally I find it to be the weakest story of the Second Doctor's era by a pretty comfortable margin. While there are many classic era stories that are perhaps too long, I usually don't mind, just so long as the story is progressing. However, I felt that the first 4 episodes of this story were basically the same thing looped over and over again. Someone goes missing, people suggest shutting down the gas refinery, the guy in command says no, rinse and repeat. Also, the climax kind of feels like a parody of the show. Victoria, a companion who is notorious for screaming, literally uses her scream to defeat the creature. On the positive side, this story has one of the better companion exits of the classic era. I love how Victoria decided that travel in the TARDIS was simply too much for her, and her goodbye with Jamie is a heartbreaking moment. Perhaps my opinion of this story will improve when I watch the upcoming animated version, but I doubt it. In 259th, we have the second Monk Trilogy story I'm going to talk about in this episode, The Pyramid at the End of the World. This is a story I really wanted to like. I love the idea of the monks using a simulation to predict a disaster so that they can save humanity from that disaster and use that to win the approval of humanity. However, this aspect of their plan is completely superseded by the whole consent thing, which is never properly explained. The monks say they need consent because ruling by fear is inefficient. If that's the case, the end of the story doesn't make any sense, as one human giving the monks consent for the sake of saving her friend has nothing to do with the consent of the rest of the human race. That being said, I love the B-plot of this story. Rachel Denning is a superb guest star, and it's very interesting to watch the slow unfolding of the bacteria release. It makes for a pretty good climax, although I do wonder why the Doctor couldn't just take a picture of the code and ask someone to read it to him. Moving into stories that I give a 4 out of 10, in 258th I have The Leisure Hive. This serial has some interesting ideas, and Pangol is a decent villain, but it's quite meandering and doesn't do a good job of structuring the plot. Much of the situation on Argolis is explained by Romana before the TARDIS even arrives there, which really takes away the fun of trying to piece together what's going on. Furthermore, the story contains a lot of dead-end plot threads that don't really matter to the story, such as Hardin's experiments and the so-called Earthling being revealed as a rogue Famasi. Also, the Doctor is basically a side character for most of the story. But hey, at least John Leeson is back. In 257th, it's another Tom Baker story, The Invisible Enemy. The first episode of this story is brilliant. For part of it, the Doctor is infected by a virus which affects his mind to the point that he almost kills Leela. However, the serial sharply declines from there. Most of the scenes have a very B-movie feel, the science is preposterous, and the climax is sorely disappointing. We do have this story to thank for giving us K9, so there's that. And in 256th, we have The Ghost Monument. This story starts off very promisingly, with a pretty enthralling crashing spaceship sequence. Then there was the introduction of the galactic race, which sounded, at the very least, pretty entertaining. However, the story becomes quite dull from there, with the characters just moving across the terrain and occasionally having to deal with random obstacles like killer robots and killer fabric. And while it wasn't clear at the time of airing, the line about the timeless child does not help my opinion of this story in retrospect. There are also a few too many cheesy lines about believing and having each other. This story really highlights the shortcomings of the Chibnall-era TARDIS crew. When you have 3 people from the same city, in the same country, on the same planet, in the same time period, they're all going to have pretty similar reactions and experiences when they travel to an alien planet. In a show that can travel anywhere in time and space, it's a sin that the characters are this homogeneous. That's actually one of the reasons I like Rosa. It's one of the very few times that the diversity of the crew matters in-universe, and it pays off as each character has a completely different experience in that story. Another random frustration I had with this story is the threat Epso used to convince Ilan to save him and Angstrom. If Ilan had the power to transport them off the planet, it's pretty hard to imagine that Ilan wouldn't have the power to kill him. That being said, I do like both Epso and Angstrom as supporting characters, and the story is at least reasonably entertaining. And the Doctor's reunion with the TARDIS is a solid scene. That's going to do it for episode 3. Hope you enjoyed, and thanks for watching. Stay tuned for episode 4, where I'll cover stories from 255th to 241st. See you next time.